The lecture hall buzzed with the comfortable arrogance of academic certainty. 300 of the brightest minds in corporate strategy filled the auditorium, their laptops gleaming, their confidence palpable. At the podium, Dr. Marcus Chen, Harvard's most celebrated professor of organizational psychology, delivered his keynote on identifying and neutralizing corporate threats with the measured authority of a man who had never been wrong about anything that mattered. Sarah Martinez sat in row 3, her pen moving across her notebook in careful strokes that had nothing to do with the professor's words. While her colleagues scribbled notes about threat assessment matrices and competitive intelligence frameworks, she was drawing connections between seemingly unrelated data points that had been troubling her for weeks. The patterns were there, hiding in plain sight, but everyone was looking in the wrong direction. The greatest threats to organizational stability, Professor Chen intoned, his laser pointer dancing across a slide filled with conventional wisdom, come from external forces, market disruption, regulatory changes, competitive pressure. We must develop sophisticated early warning systems to detect these dangers before they can inflict damage. Sarah's pen paused. She had spent the last 6 months analyzing internal communications at Meridian Technologies, the Fortune 500 company where she worked as a senior risk analyst. What she had discovered contradicted everything the professor was saying. The real threat wasn't coming from outside. It was already inside, had been inside for years, and was about to explode in a way that would make external threats look like gentle spring rain compared to a Category 5 hurricane. But, more than that, Sarah had begun to understand something profound about the nature of threats themselves. The most dangerous person in any organization wasn't the one who posed an external risk, it was the one who had learned to destroy their own weaknesses before anyone else could exploit them. Such a person became virtually invulnerable, because they had eliminated the very vulnerabilities that others might use against them. Her phone vibrated. A text from her assistant, board meeting moved up to 2 p.m. Henderson wants the Q4 threat assessment ready. Sarah glanced at her watch. 11:30. She had 2.5 hours to prepare a presentation that would either save Meridian Technologies or get her fired. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to become the very threat she was supposed to identify and neutralize. As Professor Chen droned on about external risk factors, Sarah quietly gathered her things and slipped out of the auditorium. She had work to do, and time was running short. The real education was about to begin, and it wouldn't be happening in a lecture hall. The drive back to Meridian's headquarters gave her time to organize her thoughts. For months, she had been tracking anomalies in the company's data streams, irregular communication patterns, unusual financial transfers, subtle shifts in reporting structures. Individually, these anomalies meant nothing. Collectively, they painted a picture that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Someone inside Meridian was orchestrating a systematic dismantling of the company's core infrastructure. But this wasn't corporate espionage in any traditional sense. The perpetrator wasn't stealing secrets or selling information to competitors. Instead, they were conducting a careful psychological experiment, testing the company's responses to various forms of stress, mapping its decision-making processes under pressure, and identifying exactly which pressure points could bring down the entire organization. The most terrifying part was how methodical it all appeared. Every action was calculated to reveal weakness without triggering alarm. It was as if someone was studying Meridian the way an entomologist might study an insect, with clinical detachment and scientific precision. And, based on the patterns Sarah had identified, the experiment was nearing its conclusion. She pulled into the parking garage and took the elevator to the 32nd floor, where the risk management department occupied a corner of the building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Her office was modest but strategically positioned. She could see both the executive conference room where board meetings took place and the main corridor where senior executives traveled between meetings. Over the years, she had learned to read the subtle body language that preceded major corporate decisions. Today, that body language told her that something unprecedented was about to happen. Sarah spread her research across her desk and began assembling the presentation that would either vindicate months of careful investigation or end her career at Meridian. The evidence was compelling but circumstantial. She had patterns, correlations, and statistical anomalies, but she didn't have the one thing that would make her case irrefutable: the identity of the person orchestrating the systematic testing of Meridian's vulnerabilities. That was when her computer chimed with an incoming email from an account she didn't recognize. The sender was listed simply as Internal Audit, but Sarah knew every person in the Internal Audit department, and none of them used this particular email format. She hesitated for a moment before opening the message, her finger hovering over the mouse button as she considered the possibility that this was part of whatever larger scheme she had been investigating. The email contained a single line of text and an attachment: "You're looking in the right places, but asking the wrong questions. The answer isn't who, it's why." A fellow observer. Sarah downloaded the attachment, an encrypted file that required a password. After a moment's thought, she typed row 3, a reference that only someone who had been watching her at the conference could have known. The file opened, revealing a detailed analysis of Meridian technologies that made her own investigation look elementary by comparison. The document was titled Case Study, Organizational Self-Destruction and Renewal. It outlined a comprehensive strategy for identifying and eliminating institutional weaknesses through controlled stress testing. The methodology was brilliant and disturbing in equal measure. Rather than attacking an organization from outside, the approach involved joining the organization and then systematically exposing its vulnerabilities from within, not to destroy it, but to force it to evolve beyond those vulnerabilities. The strategy was based on a simple premise: an organization that learned to identify and eliminate its own weaknesses would become virtually immune to external threats. But the process of achieving this immunity required a willingness to undergo what the document called controlled organizational death, the systematic dismantling of ineffective structures, processes, and personnel. As Sarah read deeper into the analysis, she began to understand the true scope of what had been happening at Meridian. The person behind the systematic testing wasn't trying to destroy the company. They were trying to save it by forcing it to confront and overcome its fundamental weaknesses. It was organizational chemotherapy, deliberately introducing controlled toxicity to eliminate the cancer that would otherwise metastasize and kill the entire organism. The document included detailed psychological profiles of key Meridian executives, analyzing their decision-making patterns, their responses to stress, and their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The analysis was ruthlessly objective, identifying strengths and weaknesses with clinical precision. What emerged was a portrait of an organization that had become dangerously complacent, relying on past success rather than preparing for future challenges. But the most revealing section of the document was its analysis of Sarah herself. The anonymous author had been watching her investigation, tracking her progress, and evaluating her ability to recognize patterns that others missed. The assessment was both flattering and unnerving. Subject demonstrates exceptional analytical capabilities and willingness to challenge conventional assumptions. Shows potential for strategic thinking beyond current role limitations. Primary weakness: excessive reliance on institutional validation rather than independent action. Recommendation: force choice between organizational loyalty and objective truth. Sarah realized that she had become part of the experiment. Her investigation hadn't gone unnoticed, it had been anticipated, perhaps even encouraged. The person behind the systematic testing had been studying not just Meridian's organizational weaknesses, but also the individuals within the organization who might be capable of recognizing and addressing those weaknesses. Her phone rang, interrupting her analysis. The caller ID showed David Henderson, Meridian's CEO, calling from his direct line. "Sarah, I need you in my office immediately. Bring everything you have on internal threat assessment." His voice carried an urgency she had never heard before. As she gathered her materials and prepared to walk into what might be the most important meeting of her career, Sarah understood that the real test was just beginning. The person who had been conducting this elaborate organizational experiment had engineered this moment, had anticipated her investigation, and had probably predicted exactly how she would respond to the evidence she had uncovered. The question now was whether she had the courage to present an analysis that would force Meridian's leadership to confront uncomfortable truths about their own weaknesses, or whether she would fall back on the safe, conventional threat assessment that everyone expected to hear. As she walked toward Henderson's office, Sarah reflected on the central paradox that had emerged from her investigation. The greatest threats to any organization weren't external forces that could be predicted and defended against. They were internal weaknesses that could only be eliminated through a willingness to undergo voluntary destruction and renewal. The person who had orchestrated this elaborate test understood something that most people never learned. True strength came not from avoiding challenges, but from systematically eliminating the personal and institutional weaknesses that made those challenges dangerous. Part 2: The Architecture of Voluntary Destruction. David Henderson's office occupied the northeast corner of the 40th floor, with panoramic views of the city that had made him one of the most respected CEOs in the industry. But, when Sarah entered the room, Henderson wasn't looking at the view. He was staring at a laptop screen with the expression of a man who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about his own company was wrong. "Close the door," he said without looking up. "And, before you say anything, I want you to look at this." On his screen was an email that had arrived 20 minutes earlier from an internal address that didn't correspond to any employee in the company directory. The message was brief but comprehensive. "Mr. Henderson, your organization is currently under systematic evaluation to determine whether it can evolve beyond its current limitations. The process began 18 months ago and will conclude at 3:30 p.m. today when the board votes on the proposed restructuring. You have three choices: embrace the changes that have become necessary, resist them, and watch your company fragment over the next 2 years, or investigate the source of this message and learn why voluntary transformation is preferable to involuntary collapse. Your risk analyst has been conducting parallel research. I suggest you listen to what she has discovered." Meridian's future self. Henderson finally looked up from the screen. "I've been CEO of this company for 8 years, Sarah. I thought I understood every aspect of our operations. But someone has been conducting what appears to be a comprehensive audit of our organizational effectiveness without my knowledge or authorization. They claim you've been investigating the same phenomena from a different angle." Sarah set her presentation materials on Henderson's conference table and opened her laptop. "David, what I'm about to show you is going to challenge everything we thought we knew about internal threats. The person who sent you that email isn't trying to damage Meridian. They're trying to transform it. And, based on my analysis, they may be the only reason we survive the next 5 years." For the next hour, Sarah walked Henderson through 18 months of data that revealed a pattern of systematic organizational testing. The mysterious insider had been introducing controlled stresses into Meridian's operations, not enough to cause immediate damage, but sufficient to reveal how the company responded to various types of pressure. "Look at this timeline," Sarah said, pointing to a chart on her screen. "Last January, someone leaked preliminary information about our Q1 earnings to a financial blogger. Nothing dramatic, just enough to create minor market uncertainty. Watch how our executive team responded." The data showed a cascade of defensive reactions that revealed deep organizational insecurities. Rather than addressing the underlying causes of the information leak, senior management had instituted new security protocols that primarily served to reduce communication between departments. The result was decreased operational efficiency and increased internal tension. 3 months later, Sarah continued, "Our largest client received an anonymous tip that we were planning to increase prices by 15%. The tip was accurate, we had been considering exactly that increase. But, watch what happened when the client confronted us about it. Again, the response had been defensive and, ultimately, counterproductive. Instead of using the opportunity to have a transparent conversation about pricing and value, Meridian's sales team had denied the plans and, then, quietly shelved the price increase. The result was a missed opportunity to improve profitability and a damaged relationship with their most important client." Henderson studied the data with growing comprehension. "Someone has been running controlled experiments on our decision-making processes." Exactly. And, what they discovered is that Meridian consistently responds to stress by becoming more secretive, more defensive, and less adaptive. We've been operating on the assumption that our primary threats come from external competition and market forces. But, our real vulnerability is our inability to learn and evolve under pressure. Sarah opened another file that contained financial projections based on Meridian's historical response patterns. "If these trends continue, we'll be functionally obsolete within 3 years. Not because our competitors are superior, but because we've systematically eliminated our own capacity for growth and adaptation. The door to Henderson's office opened without a knock, and board chairwoman Margaret Chen entered with the measured confidence of someone who had expected this conversation to take place. Sarah recognized her immediately. She was Professor Chen's sister, a former McKinsey partner who had been on Meridian's board for 6 years. "I hope you don't mind the interruption," Margaret said, settling into a chair across from Henderson's desk. "But I think it's time we had a more comprehensive discussion about Meridian's future." Henderson's expression shifted to one of wary comprehension. "You're behind the systematic testing." "I'm behind the systematic preparation," Margaret corrected. "Meridian is facing challenges that will require fundamental changes to how we operate." I could have presented those changes as recommendations from an external consultant, but external recommendations are easy to ignore. Instead, I chose to demonstrate why those changes have become necessary. Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place with almost audible precision. "You've been testing our organizational immune system. Every stress you introduced was designed to reveal how we respond to threats. And what those tests revealed," Margaret continued, "is that Meridian has developed antibodies against change itself. We become so focused on protecting what we have that we've lost the ability to evolve into what we need to become." Margaret opened a portfolio and spread a series of documents across Henderson's conference table. The papers contained detailed analyses of 12 major corporations that had faced similar adaptive challenges over the past decade. 6 had successfully transformed themselves and were now industry leaders. 6 had resisted change and were either bankrupt or irrelevant. The difference, Margaret explained, wasn't market position or financial resources. It was willingness to undergo voluntary destruction of ineffective systems before external forces imposed involuntary destruction of the entire organization. Henderson studied the comparative analyses with the intense focus of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions. "What kind of voluntary destruction are we talking about?" Margaret's response was delivered with the clinical precision of someone who had spent months developing detailed implementation plans. "Meridian would need to eliminate 3 layers of middle management that served primarily to filter information rather than add value. The company would need to restructure its decision-making processes to prioritize speed and adaptability over consensus and security. Most significantly, senior executives would need to accept personal accountability for outcomes in ways that most corporations avoided. The board meeting this afternoon will determine whether we proceed with this transformation voluntarily," Margaret said, "or wait for market forces to impose similar changes under less favorable circumstances." Sarah realized that her role in this scenario had been carefully orchestrated. Her investigation had been allowed to proceed because Margaret needed an internal voice that could articulate the necessity for change. The mysterious emails and encrypted documents had been designed to guide her analysis toward conclusions that aligned with the transformation strategy. "You knew I would figure out what was happening," Sarah said. "I knew that someone with your analytical capabilities would eventually recognize the patterns. What I didn't know was whether you would have the courage to recommend fundamental changes to the people who control your career advancement." The challenge was both professional and personal. Sarah could present a conventional threat assessment that identified external risks and recommended defensive measures. Such an approach would be safe, predictable, and ultimately ineffective. Or she could support Margaret's proposal for voluntary organizational transformation, knowing that the changes would be disruptive, uncomfortable, and potentially career-damaging for people throughout the company. Henderson broke the silence that had settled over the room. "Margaret, what you're describing sounds like corporate suicide." "David, what I'm describing is corporate evolution. The alternative is corporate extinction." Margaret opened her laptop and projected a financial model onto Henderson's wall screen. The projections showed 2 trajectories for Meridian's future. The first trajectory, based on current operational patterns, showed steady decline over 5 years as the company gradually lost market share to more adaptive competitors. The second trajectory, based on the proposed organizational changes, showed short-term disruption followed by accelerated growth as Meridian became more responsive to market opportunities. The question, Margaret said, is whether we have the institutional courage to choose temporary discomfort over permanent mediocrity. Sarah understood that she was witnessing a moment of corporate truth that most organizations never experienced. The person who had been systematically testing Meridian's weaknesses had also been developing solutions to those weaknesses. The entire 18-month process had been designed to create this moment when the organization would be forced to choose between defensive stagnation and adaptive transformation. But there was a deeper principle at work that extended beyond corporate strategy. Margaret had demonstrated something profound about the nature of strength itself. By systematically identifying and exposing Meridian's weaknesses, she had created an opportunity for the organization to eliminate those weaknesses voluntarily. The company that emerged from this process would be genuinely stronger because it would no longer possess the vulnerabilities that competitors might exploit. The same principle applied to individuals. People who learned to identify and eliminate their own weaknesses became virtually invulnerable to external threats. They couldn't be manipulated through fear because they had already confronted their fears. They couldn't be controlled through their insecurities because they had already addressed their insecurities. They couldn't be defeated through their limitations because they had already transcended their limitations. Henderson looked at Sarah with the expression of someone preparing to make a decision that would define the rest of his career. I want your honest assessment. Not what you think I want to hear, but what you believe is true based on everything you've discovered. Sarah realized that this moment had been inevitable from the first day she noticed anomalies in Meridian's data streams. Every step of her investigation had led to this choice between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths. The person who had orchestrated this entire scenario understood something that most people never learned: real power came not from avoiding difficult decisions, but from having the courage to make difficult decisions before they became impossible decisions. Part 3, The Invulnerable Self. The board meeting convened at exactly 2 p.m. in Meridian's 42nd floor conference room, a space designed to project corporate stability and executive confidence. 12 board members took their seats around a table that had hosted hundreds of strategic decisions over the past decade. But none of those previous meetings had carried the existential weight of what was about to unfold. Sarah sat at the presentation station with her laptop connected to the room's display system, acutely aware that the next 60 minutes would determine not only Meridian's future but also her own. She had made her choice during the conversation in Henderson's office, and there was no path back to the comfortable certainty of conventional analysis. Margaret Chen called the meeting to order with the measured authority of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. Before we proceed with the quarterly review, we need to address a matter of strategic urgency that affects every aspect of Meridian's operations. The board members shifted in their seats with the mild attention of people expecting another routine update on regulatory compliance or market conditions. None of them appeared prepared for what Sarah was about to reveal. Over the past 18 months, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to expose, Meridian Technologies has been the subject of a comprehensive organizational assessment designed to identify fundamental weaknesses in our operational structure, decision-making processes, and adaptive capabilities. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Board member William Torres leaned forward with the sharp focus of someone detecting potential litigation. Are you telling us that we've been subject to corporate espionage? I'm telling you that we've been subject to something far more sophisticated than corporate espionage, Sarah replied. We've been the subject of a systematic evaluation designed to determine whether this organization can evolve beyond its current limitations. She activated her presentation and began walking the board through 18 months of data that revealed patterns of intentional stress testing. Each slide demonstrated how carefully orchestrated pressures had revealed specific organizational vulnerabilities. The presentation was devastating in its clinical precision. The person conducting this assessment, Sarah continued, had access to our internal communications, understood our decision-making hierarchies, and possessed detailed knowledge of our competitive position. But, rather than exploiting these vulnerabilities for external gain, they used this knowledge to map exactly how we respond to various forms of organizational stress. Board member Patricia Kim raised her hand with the expression of someone struggling to process unprecedented information. Are you suggesting that someone inside our own organization has been systematically sabotaging our operations? Margaret Chan spoke for the first time since calling the meeting to order. "I'm suggesting that someone inside our organization has been systematically revealing why our current operations are fundamentally unsustainable." The silence that followed was dense with implications. Margaret had just acknowledged her role in orchestrating the 18 months of controlled organizational testing. The board members were now confronting the reality that their chairwoman had been conducting an elaborate experiment on their own company. "Margaret," Henderson said carefully, "I think you owe us a comprehensive explanation." What followed was a presentation that redefined corporate strategy for everyone in the room. Margaret had spent 2 years analyzing organizational failure patterns across multiple industries, studying companies that had successfully transformed themselves and companies that had collapsed under adaptive pressure. Her research had revealed a consistent pattern: organizations that learned to eliminate their own weaknesses voluntarily became virtually immune to external threats. The traditional approach to corporate strategy, Margaret explained, focuses on identifying external threats and developing defensive responses. But this approach has a fundamental flaw. It assumes that our primary vulnerabilities come from outside forces beyond our control. She activated a new slide that showed Meridian's organizational chart overlaid with communication flow patterns. The image revealed something disturbing: information moved through the company in ways that consistently slowed decision-making and diluted accountability. Our real vulnerabilities are internal, systemic, and entirely within our control to change. We have 3 layers of management that exist primarily to filter information rather than add value. We have decision-making processes that prioritize consensus over speed. We have accountability structures that diffuse responsibility rather than focus it. Board member Robert Zhao raised what everyone was thinking: "Margaret, why didn't you simply present these findings as recommendations rather than conducting secret tests on our own operations?" Margaret's answer revealed the psychological sophistication of her approach. Because recommendations are easy to ignore. Recommendations allow organizations to acknowledge problems without changing behaviors. What I've done is demonstrate the consequences of continuing current patterns versus the benefits of fundamental transformation. She opened a portfolio containing detailed transformation plans that had been developed over months of careful analysis. The proposals were comprehensive and disruptive. Meridian would eliminate redundant management layers, restructure decision-making processes to prioritize adaptability over stability, and implement accountability systems that tied executive compensation directly to measurable outcomes rather than tenure and consensus. "The board has 2 choices," Margaret continued. "We can implement these changes voluntarily, maintaining control over the transformation process. Or we can wait for market forces to impose similar changes under circumstances we cannot control." Sarah realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented in corporate governance. Margaret had systematically identified every weakness in Meridian's organizational structure and, then, created a moment when the board would be forced to choose between comfortable stagnation and uncomfortable evolution. But the deeper principle extended beyond corporate strategy. Margaret had demonstrated something profound about the nature of invulnerability itself. Organizations, like individuals, could achieve a form of immunity to external threats by systematically eliminating internal weaknesses. The person or organization that learned to destroy their weak self became impossible for others to destroy. Board member Lisa Park asked the question that everyone was avoiding: what happens to the people whose positions become redundant under this restructuring? Margaret's response revealed the comprehensive nature of her planning. Every person affected by these changes will receive 12 months of severance, comprehensive retraining opportunities, and priority consideration for new positions that emerge as we expand into growth markets. This isn't about eliminating people, it's about eliminating inefficiencies. The financial projections were compelling. Short-term costs of the restructuring would be offset by long-term gains in operational efficiency and market responsiveness. More importantly, the psychological effect of voluntary transformation would position Meridian as an industry leader rather than a follower of market trends. Henderson looked around the table at his fellow board members, reading their faces with the political skill of someone who had navigated corporate hierarchies for decades. "I want to hear from everyone before we vote. This decision will affect every aspect of our operations. What followed was an hour of discussion that revealed fundamental philosophical differences about the purpose of corporate governance. Some board members viewed their primary responsibility as protecting existing stakeholder interests. Others saw their role as positioning the company for future growth opportunities. Sarah listened to the debate with growing appreciation for the psychological complexity of Margaret's strategy. By conducting systematic stress tests over 18 months, Margaret had created irrefutable evidence that Meridian's current approach was unsustainable. The board couldn't dismiss her recommendations as theoretical speculation because they had witnessed the practical consequences of organizational weaknesses. Torres raised the concern that was underlying much of the resistance. Margaret, what you're proposing sounds like corporate suicide disguised as corporate strategy. Margaret's response was delivered with the calm confidence of someone who had anticipated every objection. William, what I'm proposing is corporate evolution. The alternative is corporate extinction. She activated a final slide that showed industry trends over the next 5 years. Companies that had undergone voluntary transformation were positioned to capture emerging market opportunities. Companies that had maintained traditional operational structures were losing market share to more adaptive competitors. The question, Margaret said, is whether we choose temporary discomfort or permanent mediocrity. Sarah understood that she was witnessing a moment when abstract strategic principles became concrete organizational reality. The person who had systematically tested Meridian's weaknesses had also developed comprehensive solutions to those weaknesses. The entire process had been designed to create this choice between defensive stagnation and adaptive transformation. When the vote was called, the result was unanimous. Every board member recognized that Margaret had demonstrated something undeniable. Meridian's current operational patterns were fundamentally unsustainable in a rapidly changing market environment. As the meeting concluded and board members began discussing implementation details, Sarah reflected on what she had learned about the nature of invulnerability. Organizations, like individuals, could achieve genuine strength only by systematically eliminating their own weaknesses. The person or organization that learned to destroy their weak self became impossible for others to destroy. Margaret had demonstrated this principle at the organizational level, but the same approach applied to personal development. Individuals who learned to identify and eliminate their own weaknesses, their fears, insecurities, limiting beliefs, and self-defeating behaviors, became virtually immune to external manipulation or control. The person who confronted their fear of failure could not be paralyzed by threats of setbacks. The person who addressed their need for approval could not be controlled through social pressure. The person who transcended their attachment to comfort could not be deterred by challenges or obstacles. This was the deepest insight that emerged from 18 months of organizational testing. True power came not from avoiding threats, but from systematically eliminating the internal vulnerabilities that made external threats dangerous. The individual or organization that achieved this level of self-mastery became genuinely invulnerable, not because they were protected from challenges, but because they had eliminated the weaknesses that made challenges threatening. As Sarah gathered her presentation materials and prepared to leave the conference room, she understood that her own transformation was just beginning. She had learned to see organizational patterns that others missed, but, more importantly, she had learned to act on uncomfortable truths rather than comfortable illusions. The same principle that had guided Margaret's organizational strategy could guide personal development: systematic identification and elimination of internal weaknesses, voluntary transformation before involuntary collapse, and the courage to choose temporary discomfort over permanent limitation. Margaret approached her as other board members continued their discussions about implementation timelines. Sarah, I want you to lead the organizational transformation team. What we've accomplished here is just the beginning. Sarah realized that her role in this scenario had been carefully orchestrated from the beginning, but not in a manipulative way. Margaret had recognized analytical capabilities that Sarah herself had underestimated, and had created opportunities for those capabilities to emerge and develop. The position comes with significant challenges, Margaret continued. You'll be responsible for implementing changes that many people will resist. You'll need to make decisions that prioritize long-term organizational health over short-term individual comfort. As Sarah considered the offer, she understood that this was her own moment of choosing between comfortable limitation and uncomfortable growth. She could remain in her current role, analyzing threats from a safe distance, or she could take responsibility for implementing the solutions she had helped identify. The choice was both professional and personal. Accepting Margaret's offer would require her to eliminate her own attachment to security and approval, to transcend her own comfort zone, and to develop capabilities she wasn't certain she possessed. But that uncertainty was precisely the point. The person who learned to destroy their weak self, their need for certainty, their fear of failure, their attachment to others' opinions, became truly invulnerable because they had eliminated the internal vulnerabilities that others might exploit. Sarah looked out the conference room windows at the city below, understanding that she was about to embark on her own process of voluntary transformation. The principle that had guided Margaret's organizational strategy would now guide her personal development: systematic identification and elimination of internal weaknesses, voluntary growth before involuntary stagnation, and the courage to choose temporary discomfort over permanent mediocrity. "I accept," she said, knowing that those two words marked the beginning of a journey that would require her to transcend every limitation she had previously accepted about herself. As the board meeting concluded and the implementation of Meridian's transformation began, Sarah understood that she had witnessed something unprecedented: an organization choosing to destroy its weak self in order to become invulnerable to external threats. The same principle applied to individuals who had the courage to undergo voluntary transformation rather than wait for circumstances to impose involuntary change. The man or woman who destroys their weak self can never be destroyed by others, because they have eliminated the very vulnerabilities that others might exploit. This was the deepest truth that emerged from 18 months of systematic organizational testing, and it would guide every decision Sarah made as she helped transform both Meridian Technologies and herself. In the end, everyone had misjudged the threat. They had assumed danger would come from external forces, competitors, market changes, regulatory pressures. But the real threat had been internal stagnation, and the real solution had been voluntary transformation guided by someone who understood that genuine strength comes not from avoiding challenges, but from systematically eliminating the weaknesses that make challenges dangerous. From row 3 of that university lecture hall, Sarah had begun to see patterns that others missed. Now she understood that the ability to see threats clearly was only the first step. The greater challenge was having the courage to act on that vision, to choose transformation over stagnation, and to help others make the same choice. The document that had begun as an investigation into corporate threats had become a blueprint for organizational and personal invulnerability. The principle was elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications: destroy your weak self voluntarily, and no external force can destroy you involuntarily. As Sarah left Meridian's headquarters that evening, she carried with her not just the responsibility for implementing organizational change, but also the knowledge that true security comes not from protecting weaknesses, but from eliminating them entirely. The person who masters this principle becomes genuinely invulnerable, not because they are protected from life's challenges, but because they have transcended the internal vulnerabilities that make those challenges threatening. This was Margaret's final lesson, delivered not through lecture or advice, but through 18 months of carefully orchestrated experience. The individual or organization that learns to destroy their weak self becomes truly unstoppable, because they have eliminated the very foundations upon which external threats depend.